In one of my earlier videos, I talked about a character's credibility in a scene, what that means, and how you establish it. Basically, do we feel that what a character does in a scene is believable based on what we know about their background? Gerard Butler has to deal with North Korean commandos who take over the White House, but we know he's ex-Special Forces, so his background makes his actions believable. If it doesn't match their background, we can make it believable by foreshadowing it or establishing it earlier in the movie when it's not currently important. In Gravity, Sandra Bullock needs to fly the Russian Soyuz spacecraft to the Chinese space station to steal their spacecraft to get back to Earth. This is her first mission for NASA. She wasn't a pilot, and she's about to use equipment that wasn't designed by NASA, which might make us question her ability to do this. This is why, in the scene before it becomes important, she talks with George Clooney about how she struggled in the simulator to fly the Soyuz. Now we know that she was trained, which gives her credibility to fly the Russian spacecraft. Clooney tells her that the Chinese spacecraft is a copy of the Soyuz, so now she has the credibility to fly that as well. In my earlier video, I focused on Rey's piloting skills in the escape from Jakku, but I also said we could apply those same standards of background or foreshadowing to the other big events of Rey's journey and see where she is and isn't credible. One of the most important moments for Rey happens in the scene where she mind tricks FN-007. The first time I saw this in theaters, my movie-watching brain thought, wow, she's doing a mind trick. But then my analytical brain, which shouldn't be part of my internal monologue right now, decided to speak up. Wait a minute, how does she know how to do that? To be clear, I'm not questioning her ability to do it. That's a separate discussion, and I took this to be one of those show don't tell moments. Based on what we've seen in the previous movies, this is more than the awakening of a Force user. This is the awakening of an extremely powerful Force user. That is what her ability to do this shows. What I'm asking is, how does she know that mind trick is a thing? And how does she know to do it like that? Is this credible? Well, she's not a trained Force user, so it's not in her background, but we can get around that if it was foreshadowed. So was it? On Takodana, we learned that she is Force sensitive, so her ability to stare down Kylo and mind trick James Bond doesn't come from nowhere. We saw earlier that she thought Luke Skywalker was a myth, and then she exclaimed, "The Jedi were real," before Han tells her and Finn that
it's all true.
But what does all of it mean? This is when I get annoyed with people who say you don't need every detail explained. Most of the time that's true, but this is one of Rey's biggest moments in the movie. She's heard of Luke Skywalker and she knows about the Jedi. Does she know about the Force and the Jedi's powers? Maybe, maybe not. That she describes Luke as a myth means she might have incomplete or inaccurate information. That would make sense for a scavenger working at a remote outpost on a nowhere planet like Jakku. They needed to be more explicit that she knew that this was a thing, so that in this moment I'm thinking,
the Force is strong in this one.
Instead of wondering how she knows about it in the first place. We know what a mind trick is. How does she know what a mind trick is? Not to mention, what if the viewer doesn't know what a mind trick is? This is one of the areas where I struggle in how exactly to evaluate these films, because on the one hand, to some extent, a movie should be able to stand on its own, but on the other hand, these films don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of a larger story, and this trilogy especially makes the assumption that some parts of the story have already been explained to you. This is one of the reasons why I think these movies didn't really land in China. They don't have some of the information that we need to understand what's going on. We do get the obligatory scene where we're told that this universe has a magic system. In A New Hope, Luke is the audience stand-in, so like us, he needs these things explained to him.
The Force?
In The Force Awakens, our audience stand-in, like us, has heard of the Jedi and I guess the Force, but again, how much does she know? If this is your first Star Wars movie, you still don't know what the Force can do, who can use it, or what its limitations are. Now in this scene, I think they did a pretty good job with body language and sound effects in conveying what's happening, but they haven't made clear how Rey suddenly knows how to do this, or what exactly she's doing. What about her interaction with Kylo in the previous scene? Well, that might work, except that's not at all what she does to FN-007. With Kylo, she was blocking his attempt to get in her head, and she's so wizard that she ended up getting into his head and calling out his insecurity. It's a similar idea, but how would she know to do it differently than Kylo did? If he had begun his interrogation by trying to mind trick her, exactly the way that she is doing now, that would have been a cool moment. And my internal monologue could say, oh, she's doing what he tried to do to her. Cool. What about the Force download? I don't know if you've heard of this, but one of the explanations for how Rey got so powerful so fast without any training is that she learned how to do these things by getting into Kylo's mind. First, this is not in the movie, nor is it in The Last Jedi. Second, if it was, would that not be an incredibly effective way to train people? Now, for reasons that will become clear, we'll return to this scene later, but for right now, I have to say that I did not find her to be credible in this scene, and this is actually the moment when the character lost me and I was no longer in the movie. And I know that because when I was sitting there in the theater while Rey and Kylo squared off in the woods, I wasn't really focused on the fight that was happening. I kept wondering, where is the light coming from in this scene? It looks like moonlight, but this planet was moved here. It doesn't have a moon, and even if it did, they just drained the sun, so there's no sunlight to be reflected by this moon that isn't there. Obviously, the scene needs to be lit so we can actually see what's happening, and Star Wars has never been married to the laws of physics, but I say this to make the point that this is not what I should have been thinking about. My brain should be focusing on the climax of the movie, not wondering how that climax is being lit. To be clear, I'm not looking at the wrong thing, I am seeing the wrong thing. This is what happens when my suspension of disbelief is gone. These are things your brain sees but chooses to ignore because you're in the story, which again is how I know that I wasn't. So finally, let's talk about Finn and Rey versus Kylo in the woods. Is this credible? In some areas, yes, in some areas, no, and in some areas it could have been done better if they'd stuck to the script. First, let's talk about each character's credibility when it comes to combat with a lightsaber. We've seen that Kylo is familiar with a lightsaber since the first scene of the movie, and we know he was trained by Luke, so it's in his background and he should be the best one here. Finn is a soldier, so combat is in his background, but he already had a chance to wield a lightsaber earlier in the movie, and that didn't really go his way. The same thing happens here. Even though Finn does put up a good fight, Kylo is clearly playing with his food. It's only by luck and Kylo's overconfidence that Finn gets a hit in, after which an enraged Kylo finishes him off. This part seemed entirely credible to me. Kylo is having fun, and Finn is able to hold his own for a bit, but he ultimately loses to Kylo. There were some deviations from the script, though. Two things in particular at the beginning of this fight have always stuck out to me. First, when Kylo says, "That lightsaber, it belongs to me," Finn replies, "Come get it." And then Finn charges at Kylo. I thought that was rather odd, and I was right, because in the script, when Finn says, "Come get it," Kylo is supposed to move to Finn. The other thing that is impossible for me to unsee is that when Kylo knocks out Rey and Finn rushes to her side, Finn throws his blaster away. That always struck me as really odd, uncredible behavior from a trained soldier, especially when he was in the exact same situation at the beginning of the movie and didn't throw his blaster away. I think they had to do this because in the script, Rey is the one holding the blaster when they run into Kylo, and Finn is already holding the lightsaber. The larger deviation from the script, though, has to do with the biggest defense for Rey winning this fight, which is Kylo's injury. When people say that Kylo loses this fight because he's injured, according to the script, that's true. In the script, we are shown that Kylo is clearly hampered by his wound, but I don't think that really comes across in the movie. He seems to be drawing on his pain for additional strength from the dark side rather than being held back by it, at least when he's fighting Finn. Now let's get to the main event, which is Kylo versus Rey. Kylo strains to summon the lightsaber only to have it whiz past him and fly towards, to everyone's surprise, including her, Rey. This was another moment where my first reaction was, "Whoa, look at that!" only to be immediately replaced with, "How does she know how to do that?" Again, not her ability to do it, but how does she know that that's a thing? How does she know to reach out and pull the lightsaber to her? This is another huge moment in Rey's story, and they needed to be more explicit that she knew that this was possible. Before we continue with the fight, I'm going to jump ahead to the section of the video where I make my suggestion on how it could have been done differently. When Han tells Rey and Finn about Luke and the Jedi, I would extend Rey's response to have her say,
"The Jedi were real.
They could control people's minds and make things float? And Han could say that, yeah.
It's all true.
This achieves a couple of important things. Now we know that she knows these two force powers exist, which helps with her credibility. But it's also a promise that we're going to see her do these things, which makes it more satisfying when she does. Back to the woods. The shock and surprise of Rey summoning the lightsaber to her instead of him gives Rey the advantage for just a few moments. Then Kylo retakes the initiative and Rey is on defense and in retreat until we get to the edge of the cliff. In my previous video, I said that Rey having a staff and using it in the thug fight on Jakku is what gives her combat credibility in this scene. That is the purpose of that moment in the movie. In terms of movie credibility, I think that's fine, but if you wanted to be a stickler about this and say that a staff and a lightsaber are not the same kind of weapon, I think that's a fair opinion to have. It would have been better for Rey's credibility if the weapon she carried around Jakku was an analog for a lightsaber. But this is one of those things that you would most likely be willing to overlook if you were more satisfied with the character and the movie. I find it to be more credible because she's not really that good with the lightsaber in this scene, or at least not as good as she is here, which, by the way, is only about 2 or 3 days after this. After Kylo recovers from his initial shock, Rey is on defense and in retreat until Kylo pushes Rey to the literal edge and yells into her face,
"I could show you the ways of the Force!"
So we have some motivation and additional credibility for him not immediately trying to kill her, because he wants to bring her over to his side. This reminds Rey that the Force is a thing, and so she closes her eyes, focuses, and unlocks the cheat menu, which gives her the strength to defeat him. I have a few things to say about this, but I want to start with where I think this works. This is essentially the same as Luke's moment in the Death Star trench when Obi-Wan tells him to use the Force instead of his targeting computer. The reason that works is that earlier in the movie, Obi-Wan showed him exactly what he needed to know to do what he needs to do in this moment.
This time, let go your conscious self and act on instinct.
Maz does the same thing for Rey on Takodana, telling her exactly what she needed to do to access the cheat codes during the climax of the movie.
Close your eyes. Feel it. The light. It will guide you.
This is Rey's first interaction with the Force where I know exactly how she knows to do what she is doing. That's why this moment works. That in mind, let's talk about why this didn't work for me. But to do that, I think no one could express why this part feels wrong better than the man himself, J.J. Abrams.
Where she basically feels it, accepts it, and is now ready to kick his ass.
That's not how the Force works. At least, not the kind of Force that we want her to be tapping into. Remember, these movies don't exist in a vacuum. When I watch this scene, I see Luke versus Vader on the Death Star. I see Anakin versus the Tusken villagers, or Anakin versus Count Dooku. Maz told her how to tap into the light side, but is that what she's doing here? Based on what we've seen in other movies, it sure doesn't look like it. If they had presented this as Rey using her fear and anger to tap into the dark, that would mesh better with my previous understanding of the Force and make her victory here more credible. It's the Force cheat code that allows her to turn the tide and win this fight, and whether that is credible or not, I think depends on your views on the Force, because to me,
That's not how the Force works.
the other big reason why this moment didn't work for me is that this is supposed to be the climax of the movie, where Rey accepts the Force like Luke did in A New Hope. He can't destroy the Death Star until he does that, and Rey can't defeat Kylo until she does the same. Maz told Rey exactly what she needed to do to accomplish this, but that isn't what Rey is doing with FN-007. This brings us back to the question of how does Rey know to do this like that? How does she know to calm herself to tap into the Force this way? Why is she then so shocked when the lightsaber flies to her in the woods? And why, a minute later, has she completely forgotten that this happened? The Force? You mean that thing I did 2 minutes ago? Maybe I should try that again. But this is more of a structural issue than one of credibility. One of the alternative suggestions that I originally considered is that Rey should fail to mindtrick FN-007 and to summon the lightsaber, and not succeed with the Force until she's pushed to the edge and does what Maz told her to. She could fail at the mind trick and have to rely on her mechanical knowledge to escape, which she has credibility for in her background. We could see her try to summon the lightsaber, fail, and instead use her athletic ability to intercept it from Kylo. Then, when she's pushed to the edge and succeeds, it's more satisfying because of the rule of 3. You can actually see this at work in the mind trick scene. She fails to mind trick 007 twice, and it's not until the third attempt that she's actually able to do it. So, having gone over all that, I do think that Rey's combat ability as presented in the movie is credible enough for the difference between a staff and a lightsaber to be overlooked if you were satisfied with the overall movie. Kylo's injury and his desire to turn her instead of kill her also adds to her credibility, although they could have done a better job showing that his injury really was holding him back. I don't think her use of the Force is credible in this movie, other than the moment where she accesses the cheat codes. It's unclear how she knows these are Force powers that can be used or how to do them. I think it's a reasonable argument to say that she could have learned of the existence of these abilities just from the legends she refers to. But I think these moments are so important to her journey that they could have and should have been more clear about this in the movie. These are separate issues from her being strong enough in the Force to actually do them. I have less of a problem with that because we learn she is Force sensitive when it's not important, and her strength is acknowledged by a third party, which gives her power credibility. The bigger issue there is how that contrasts with how we've seen the Force work in previous movies, and whether or not you're willing to accept the difference. I don't have a significant issue with the mechanics of Rey beating Kylo in the woods. My main issues with this are structural, and that the fight happens in the first place. Consider that in the original trilogy, Luke had 3 big confrontations with his antagonist, Darth Vader, each confrontation happening at the climax of the movie. In The Force Awakens, this fight is Rey's 3rd confrontation with her antagonist in the same movie. I could and will talk about that more at some point, but that is a good question for another time. So what do you think? Is Rey credible or uncredible in these moments? And if you disagree with anything I've said here today, feel free to tell me why in the comments. And if you liked or hated today's video, I'd appreciate a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and maybe think about subscribing if you'd like to see some more. But that's all I got for you today. I thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you next time, and may the Force be with you, always.